Okay, thanks so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to share this session with a biologist interested in economics. I'm rather the opposite. I'm a natural resources economist fascinated by biology, and let alone after this great presentation. So I'd like to share with you some insights on what I feel that we could call economic paradoxes as to long-term food security and how this connects with different crises. So long-term water security, the energy crisis, the worst crisis in the last 50 years, actually, and of course the climate emergency and the potential collapse for biodiversity and ecosystem services. So the first idea is very much about trying to have the wider picture in mind. I work in more than 80 countries, and I find it difficult to forget about the wider picture because I'm continuously comparing one country to another. So if you look at the momentum for sustainability, you might see contradictory trends here. The first one saying, for instance, you've got that report from the World Economic Forum saying that sustainability is the new digitalization, yeah? And both for good and for bad, because we're finding the kind of reluctances and drawbacks that we used to find a few years ago when we were discussing about a wide range of new technologies. But at the same time, we see a significant backlash, especially in the US, as to whatever has to do with impact measurement and actual formal compliance with ESG metrics. Yeah? But this at the same time is happening within a context in which these two giants are competing to be which one is more sustainable. Yeah? You may have heard of the significant fiscal stimulus program by the European Union called Next Generation EU, and how a third of the investment is going to sustainability, another third to the digitization of the economy, and the last third to leaving no one behind, so inclusive models. But what we didn't know is that last year, back in August 2022, the administration from President Biden managed to approve the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. And the Inflation Reduction Act is not just about putting prices down, it's very much about trying to catch up with the rest of the world in terms of sustainability. And this is proving a very agile process of providing subsidies for sustainable investments. My question here is whether this is leading to the unintended outcome of a significant increase in the marginal cost of uptaking new technologies as a result of this competition between these two giants, or rather the opposite. It may well be the case, and we still have no evidence, it may well be the case that this leads to a significant decrease in the marginal cost of uptaking climate tech, ag tech, etc. Right. But if I said that this is a great momentum for sustainability, it's because this fiscal stimulus, this wealth of public money, is not just in the European Union or the US, it's also happening in China, Japan, South Korea, etc. But of course, the greenness of those investments is not even, between all these regions in the world. When you look at some evidence from private financial markets worldwide, you see that there's also a significant, we're heading back up in terms of increasing the excess of liquidity in these markets. So there's money. And I think we should call it a day now, because financial constraints are not a constraint anymore. We've got money there. Whether it's channeled to the right investment is a completely different matter. But we do have money. And I wouldn't say that we do have a technological constraint either. I think that you all excel at delivering technologies. So if we do have the technologies and we have the money, why are we still struggling? Why do we have so many unsustainable patterns, right? If you look at a structural feature of our economy, it has to do very much with the level of indebtedness. So we have public money, but we have this liability that has to do with the fact that in order to produce an additional unit of GDP, now we need to become more and more indebted. And this is not happening anymore in places like Argentina or Mexico only. It's also happening in the US, the UK, some significant economies in the European Union. Right. At the same time, you could actually see that this is leading to an increase in the probability of default, both for some countries and also for some companies. And whatever is happening now, it happens after the first retreat in the globalization process, which is of course affecting global trade of agricultural products as well. Right. And if I come back to Europe, look at on your left-hand side. Those are the most important internet-based companies in terms of the stock value, right? What you see there is a full list of companies. None of them is European. So Europe seems to become kind of a, if I may use this word, a beautiful theme park, because geopolitically, unless it manages to succeed in terms of sustainability and kind of promoting, civil rights and welfare state, we have nothing to say geopolitically, because that technological race is not anymore for us, right? If you look on your right-hand side, you can actually see significant evidence of a country, China, who's not just responsible for 50% of all imports of raw materials in the world, but it's also gaining momentum in places in which they were not leading the world, semiconductors, etc. So this is starting to happen, and these tectonic plates movements, are something to consider from my viewpoint, from an agro-food perspective as well. Right. I'll go back to some of the ideas that Chris mentioned. I think you're absolutely right. I can only echo what he said in terms of climate change. But we tend to focus on the idea that climate change is a global phenomenon, and it is a global phenomenon. It will affect us all, but it will not affect us all in the same way. So it's asymmetric. If you focus specifically, for instance, in a place in which agriculture is providing around like 1/5 of all gross value added of the European agriculture, which is in the Mediterranean basins, you can actually see that the temperature rise will be 1 degree Celsius above the average global increase in temperature as well. So it's not affecting us all to the same extent, right? If we focus specifically on some of the strong evidence discussed from the IPCC on climate change, we know first, as Chris mentioned, it's not change that matters, it's the pace and the intensity of this change. You can see that at the center of this slide. Second, it's driven by our actions. We're co-responsible for this problem. We're co-responsible for solutions as well. And third, which I think is really critical, we are facing irreversible thresholds. We're facing no linear effects. But what's really critical, and I can only second what Chris was saying, is that we're dealing with uncertainty. It's not that we have less rainfall. It may well be that we have less rainfall, but at the same time that we have rainfall when we don't need it, or, for instance, Sussex, Southeast England, suffering now every year from floods and droughts within the same year. If you look at this, it's the tails of the distribution that matter. So that level of uncertainty proves that sustainability from my economic standpoint is very much about mastering complexity and uncertainty, right? If you focus on our global response to that, the international community responds in a very effective way. We decarbonize the economy. I always tell my students that this picture is the most significant structural change they will ever see in their life, in terms of structural change of their economies. But when you look at this, we see that we're very far from getting there. We're very far from going through that tipping point of actually reducing net carbon emissions. What's my point here, and the reason why I mentioned climate change, is because I do think that we have a sound roadmap for mitigation. We know we have to go through an energy transition and an equivalent transition in the way we transport people and commodities. But I think that the poor cousin in all discussions, climate change adaptation, is continuously downplayed, if not overlooked at all. And I think the whole discussion we're going to have here for these next 2 days is relevant to adaptation as well as to mitigation. Because the IPCC said in their latest report, there are no mitigation pathways without adaptation pathways. Do we have an equivalent roadmap for adaptation? I don't think we do. This community can contribute to build that ambitious roadmap in terms of actually adapting to current and future impacts of climate change. Right, and let me get to the core of my talk today. I think we have very good reasons to make really bad decisions. I'm an economist. So when people tell me, no, we end up with unsustainable patterns just because we're stupid, we don't have enough information or knowledge, well, that might be a part of an explanation. I don't think it's a very good explanation. Some of the people may say, no, we're not stupid, we're just evil. We just boycott ourselves. Someone's conspiring against ourselves. Depending on your ideological standpoint, it could actually be the States or China or Saudi Arabia or whoever. What's really important here is that from an economic viewpoint, we see that we're facing very strong incentives to make very lousy decisions, right? And let me just give you an explanation. This is the challenge we're talking about, yeah? FAO projected that we need to increase in order to feed 9.6 billion people in the world through 2050, we need to increase our production of calories by 69%. And we have to keep up with macroeconomic performance, and we have to be able to face the climate emergency. What's really interesting here is that this is the challenge. We need to be able to produce more calories related to some of these crops. Okay, as a scientist, I wondered, yeah, how is arable land evolving in the world? And when you look at the places where food is being produced, yeah, you actually realize that it may well be the case that our installed capacity to produce food is decreasing worldwide. I wanted to have a look at that, and there's some correspondence, which is it may sound crazy for an extraterrestrial inhabitant, yeah, but it may sound crazy, but we produce food where there's no water. We mostly produce food where there's no water, so we fish where there's no fish. Okay? Right. My point here is that if you look at the increase of arable land, you see that it's increasing, it's sluggish growth rates, yeah, but it's increasing mostly as a result of emerging economies, yeah? Definitely not as a result of advanced economies. But when you express this in the right way, as people told us at university, which is per capita, it's plummeting, it's collapsing. So our ability to produce food per capita is collapsing. How do you solve this equation? Well, you know how you solve this equation. Yeah, some years ago, yeah, we went through that tipping point in which we managed to increase global agricultural production without necessarily increasing our global agricultural land use. Yeah? So we know how to do that. We know that we have to produce more and we have to work on nutrient density, as Chris explained. Yeah? So we have to produce more nutrients per unit of land, because we don't have as much land as we would like in order to be able to hit the target, okay? My point here is that, are we actually doing that? Yes, we're increasing yields, yeah? That's the continuous line. Dotted line, yeah? Not as fast as we would need in order to succeed. We might not be able to make it, okay? So again, what is the unintended outcome of all these? The unintended outcome is that we end up putting more and more pressure on soil and water resources, mostly. Yeah? And you can see the front cover of the New York Times. You'll agree with me, this is not any newspaper. Yeah, it's an important one. Yeah? And 3 years ago, they said 25%, they were echoing this report from the Aqueduct Project, from this think tank based in Washington, the World Resources Institute. And they were saying 25% of the population in the world by 2040 will be suffering from long-term water stress. Yeah? This is a gap between long-term availability of renewable resources and current and future demands. Yeah? If we express that by catchment, what you see is that the kind of situation that I see here in my home country in Spain, yeah, or in other Mediterranean basins, regardless of whether they're Southern European countries or Northern African countries, is the same as we would find in Central republics in Asia, or in large areas of China and India, or in Southern Australia, or in the Pacific coast of Latin America, or in the 17 western states of the US. It's exactly the same type of situation that we're facing. And this is, among other things, proving absolutely disruptive in terms of supply chains. Yeah? This is happening in the Mississippi. There's a major drought in the Mississippi. This drought in the Mississippi a year ago was coincident with a major drought in Central and Eastern Europe that also affected the energy world in the midst of the worst energy crisis in the last 50 years. But this is happening in the Yangtze, and this is happening in the Panama Canal. And it's not happening, in different years. It's happening at once. And this is proving massively disruptive for global supply chains. For instance, if you think about whatever happened with the Danube or the Rhine last year, we realized here in Europe that those waterways were critical for the trade of fertilizers in the midst of a global food security crisis. Right, and let me just finish with two paradoxes, just two paradoxes. The first one is what we call the rebound effect. So it may well be the case, just to put it very simple, it may well be the case that all of you succeed at designing and implementing great technologies in order to be more efficient in the way we produce food. Yeah? And imagine that some of you are also specifically working on the efficient use of water. And we managed to enhance that use of water. If we manage to do so at a plot level, it may well be the case, and there's very strong evidence about this, it may well be the case that we have individual efficiency gains at a plot level that are completely outweighed, yeah, by the scale or a change in the crop mix, or there are different pathways through which these rebound effects are happening. And the outcome of this, yeah, which is appalling, is that we are more and more efficient at a plot level, yeah, but this does not translate to more water being available at a catchment level. You see my point? So it may well be the case that the more efficient we are, the more water we use. And the same applies to the energy sector. The more efficient we are on energy grounds, the more energy we end up using on aggregate. Or the same happens to how you fuel your engines in your vehicles. Yeah? That congestion or pollution is not decreasing, even if our fuels on our vehicles are much more efficient than they used to be 10 years ago. Yeah? So these kind of scale effects are relevant to consider. If you focus specifically on one of the issues that's been mentioned before, yeah, the ability to be more efficient in terms of reducing food loss and waste, you can actually see that some of those effects might be offset by these rebound effects I'm referring to. So we need to, this is not to say, the conclusion about this is do not become more efficient. No, the conclusion is invest on efficiency, but we need some encompassing measures in order for these technologies to deliver. Because otherwise, you'll be very successful at delivering technologies and not very successful at contributing to more sustainable patterns. If you look at whatever happens in, this is the second paradox, if you look at whatever happens in Australia, for instance, yeah, after the millennium drought, 14 years of continuous drought, yeah, they needed to go through a massive water reform in the country. One of the opportunities they have, and this is represented by this map, is to actually work on decentralized desalination of brackish water in order to be used for agriculture. This is an opportunity. The same happens in the US. This is an MIT study showing that there is a correlation between places in which we have an increased salinity of aquifers, overexploited aquifers, but also the ability to use renewable energies in order to desalinate brackish water that can be supplied to agriculture. Right, so this sounds great. Circular economy sounds great. Why aren't these happening spontaneously? If they're great, why do not they happen spontaneously? And one of the reasons for that is because if you look at the asymmetry in terms of the marginal cost of using 1 cubic meter from different water supply sources, you see that the diversification of water supply sources is not straightforward. Yeah? It's still much cheaper to use unsustainably surface runoff or groundwater resources rather than reclaiming water for reuse or desalinating salt water and brackish water. So this, to me, has nothing to do with a technological drawback. This, to me, has to do with governance, and it has to do with redesigning incentives. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. Those are just wonderful, wonderful ways to start. And we're going to open to questions, but I actually have a first question, and it relates to both of you. But Christopher, it comes off the slide you showed of Molly, who you were showing lives in Surrey, a wealthy part of the country, close to Sussex, which you were describing, has had, where I come from, floods, droughts. And Molly, I noticed at the bottom, trained at the Knepp estate. And people who don't know about Knepp, it was written about by a woman called Isabella Tree in a wonderful book called Wilding. And this is a big estate in Sussex, England, that had been dairy. And when this family realized they had to put another $1 million into their dairy parlors, they got rid of dairy and rewilded their property and now make quite a lot of money from agro-tourism, bringing people onto their land and training people like Molly. How realistic is a model like that? It's a wonderful story, Wilding, about turning this country estate in southern England back to the wild. They have pigs running wild. They're no longer producing milk. They're training people like Molly to produce food on 100 acres in a wealthy area where people can buy their food from farmers' markets. But I'm curious about that as a model going ahead in any way. It's kind of caught on. It's become very fashionable. And you were praising Molly, but tell me more about it.
Yeah, tell you more about Molly. Okay, so
why this should work.
Why this should work. It works because to grow resilient crops, you need to have areas set aside for biodiversity because you need predators. You need to have the whole ecosystem. We don't know exactly, there hasn't been enough research, so we don't know exactly what proportion needs to be set aside. But we've got some guesses. So it ranges from 3 to 1. So for every hectare of cereals or vegetables, whatever it is, you need to have 3 hectares set aside for hedgerows and small woodlands and goodness knows.
So goodbye guerrilla gardening in Philadelphia because you can only garden in your little...
You can be more productive. You will grow in the vegetable terms. In cereals it's a bit different, but in vegetable terms you can get 4 crops a year instead of 2. So you can actually farm much more intensively on a smaller area if, paradoxically, you set aside areas as well. So it does require, again, a systems approach to thinking about farming. The NEP estate is...
It's fascinating. Wilding is a wonderful book.
It will happen once. So,
yeah.
I mean, it won't feed very many people.
Right.
So it's not something that will... It's great for nature. And it has had a really big impact in terms of it's become totemic in its impact.
Right, the book is worth reading. And
yeah, the book is great.
The place is worth visiting.
But it doesn't produce much food.
Right.
Molly does.
Molly does. Please, everybody else, I'd love to... Go ahead, Juan.
Yes, I have a question for Gonzalo. You were saying that there are a lot of funds available for sustainability today, both in the US and a bit less in Europe. Now, I think one of the big problems is that most of that money may not go to real sustainable things. So today, I think the allocation of that money is more in lobbyist hands than in science-based hands. And as an example, for example, related to the other point you were making about the chances that we may not have enough land in the future to feed people. So today we are using roughly 8% of the total land for biofuels. So biofuels are heavily subsidized by the money that you are saying is used for sustainability. So there are a lot of trade-offs in that logic. You can make the case that if you use that money for other purposes, you suddenly free up that 8% to feed people, so prices would be lower and the pressure on the system would be less intense.
Yeah, that's an interesting example of a trade-off. And you may recall, there was a huge momentum for liquid biofuels for transport like 15 years ago. I was working for the UN by then. I was based in Santiago in Chile. And I recall the whole conversation about whether Latin America should be putting loads of money in order to become like a primary producer of the feedstocks to be used in order to produce these biofuels, or rather to use it as, as a driver for industrialization and being able to actually produce liquid biofuels themselves. Yeah, that was never sorted out from my viewpoint. But when you look at biofuels, it's not so much that 8% of the land is being used for that, is that those biofuels are not properly delivering in terms of carbon neutrality and all that, because we were in the assessment, in the life cycle assessment of those products, we were overlooking issues that have to do with the industrial process itself and with the transport of those fuels. So if you don't consider that carbon neutrality that you may refer to in the terms of burning biomass, does not apply. So I think that's precisely, and you got it right, because that's precisely what I meant when I said that from my viewpoint, sustainability is about mastering complexity and uncertainty. These are complex issues, so we cannot go for simple solutions, simplistic solutions. And then in terms of the money being used for this, I agree with what you say. And there's also this issue, for instance, people complaining here in Europe that in order to access next generation EU funds, bureaucracy is really tough. And this is one of the reasons why we're starting to see some disinvestment from European companies going to the US, because they feel that the Inflation Reduction Act is much more easy for them to access those funds. I feel, and that's the point that I wanted to make when I refer to these paradoxes, specifically to the rebound effect, is that it will be a tragedy if you all manage to deliver the right technologies, but at the end of the day, there are some of the constraints preventing us from being more sustainable. So imagine that the money reaches you and you manage to deliver something that is really sustainable. It may be the case that it's only sustainable at a plot level. You change the life of the farmers, They pay a bit more in terms of energy because it's a technified process. They save significantly in terms of water, 80-90% of the water against baseline, So you change the quality of life of these people, but at the end of the day, it may well be the case that they're affected. There's a great natural resources economist called Michael Hahnemann. He was born in Manchester, but he's based in the US. He's been based in the US for the last, 50 years or so. And Michael, when he works in Berkeley and Arizona, and when he goes to California and talks to farmers, he asks them this very provocative question. He asks them, would you like to remain being farmers, or would you rather go and be entrepreneurs? Why? Because if they have an entrepreneurial mind, they'll be more interested than anyone else in conserving the natural resource base.
Another question, lots of questions down there.
Yeah, over here. Yes, I loved that Christopher brought the role of this new generation of farmers. I call it neo-farmers because we are due to climate change, we're losing farmers everywhere in the world. But there is a new generation of farmers that embrace the enough mindset, that they have they've gone to university, they have studies, and they come back to their hometowns and they start a new life connected to nature, connected with the rural areas, and they embrace technology, but also enough. They don't need to build an empire, an agriculture empire. And this brings me to the idea of moving from the economy of a scale to economy of impact.
Yeah, no, it's good. The three, so then going back to that kale example, which is small scale replicating. So there's a sales and marketing organization that's going to be processing and selling the kale, whatever it is. The kale is going to be bought from small farms locally. So again, this is sort of local thing. And by chance, actually, the first three growers are on what are called multi-enterprise farms. And this is something that I've seen happening quite a lot. So a multi-enterprise farm is you take an area, say 100 hectares or 50 hectares, whatever it is, and there are multiple enterprises on that piece of land. So you might have a small cheese-making operation, you might have some vegetable growing, you might have some cereals or some vineyards, but it's on the same piece of land. And this is really important because people, one of the problems with farming is it just goes on forever. It never stops. You are chained to the land. But on a multi-enterprise farm, people can support each other. So somebody a young person coming established in agriculture can actually take a holiday. This is, for most farmers, this is an alien concept because they cannot take holidays ever. But to keep young people on the land, we've got to have a modern lifestyle. We've got to have holidays. We've got to be able to educate their kids, and we've got to provide these other things. So it's quite interesting. So the three multi-enterprise farms that I'm currently working with, before they were multi-enterprise, they had, each of them, they're roughly the same size, had 0.6 of a laborer on it. So it wasn't even enough to sustain one livelihood. Each of these farms now has 3 enterprises, and one of them employs about, I think, 5. There's probably half a dozen people employed in each one of those locations. And the impact in terms of food production is at least twice of what they were producing. So there's more food, more money, more livelihood.
We have the cooperative in here in Spain, but I think we should evolve the cooperative model into this technology-based new generation of farmers that not only work to sell volume, but also biodiversity, lots of different vegetables and plants, and the goal should not be to go to the big retailers, but to find different alternatives way of serving food. So I think cooperative is this multi-enterprise that you mentioned, but this is old-fashioned, of course. So far, it's old-fashioned. We have to redesign the model of a cooperative, technology-intensive, and with purpose.
Yeah, no, and you're absolutely right. I mean, the supply chains are completely not fit for purpose for modern agriculture. And I'll give you an example. At the beginning of this year, there was a shortage of vegetables in a lot of European countries because there was a frost in Morocco. I can't remember exactly what happened. So the local supermarket next to one of these farms I was talking about in Gloucestershire, they ran out of vegetables on their shelves. I was composting vegetables that I couldn't sell 500 meters from that shop. The manager of that supermarket would refuse to buy my vegetables unless he had approval from head office in Sheffield. That food was wasted, thrown away because of the dysfunctional nature of the supply chain. No other reason.
I'm going to take 2 more questions in this session, and there was one right down there, and then I'll take your question after that, and then we should probably move on.
Yes.
There's going to be lots of time to talk as we go on.
It's a question to Christopher.
Yeah?
When we look at the trends that you presented with the challenges and the upsides, it looks like they are very well adapted to the developing countries. But what about the emerging countries? How do you think they can catch up this train with their means and their starting point?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there's two routes to doing this. The first one is we have to shift the money that is going into research, into the use of agrochemicals, if you like, but also in food processing. In a lot of emerging economies, they are investing heavily in how to process a lot of produce. And that has to shift. I mean, if literally 10% or even less of the funds that were going into how to make the next wonderful aroma for a packet of crisps was going into how to regenerate soils and produce healthy food in the first place, it would make a huge difference for these emerging economies. And I think it would give them a competitive edge in world markets, because I think increasingly buyers are saying, no, we don't want this. And I'll give you an example, say glyphosate, which is very topical, for example. It can be used in 2 ways. You can use it to kill all the grass, but you can also use it as a desiccant. And what that means is you can spray it on your crops to dry them out, which means you don't have to pay to dry them in the dryer. So you say, as a farmer, you can save quite a bit of money by spraying your crops with glyphosate just before you harvest. The problem with that is there's a lot of glyphosate residue in the oats or the flour or whatever it is you're then selling on. And so if I'm a buyer in wherever it is and I'm looking for glyphosate residues, I'm going to find a much higher level of glyphosate residues in commodities coming from emerging economies, like, for example, Ukraine, than I will in other countries. And this is going to have an impact. So we need to, but it can be changed. It can be changed.
First of all, thank you both for your inspiring presentations. More than a question is a reinforcement of a couple of points from both of you. Yes, small is good, but big is more profitable. That appears to be the trend. And we have to make such that this business model for small farmers become really, really profitable on the big scale. Mm-hmm. I think you know that. Avoiding the commodity trap is a fantastic message, but in history, who has removed the sales and marketing tasks from farmers have been the middlemen, exploiting them in doing that. So we have to be careful. But the link between the two presentations that I most care is the link of the natural capital. Biodiversity, you said, and I think Gonzalo went on the point of asymmetry of climate change. That asymmetry, in my view, and this is a question, requires changement of rules in world trade. Chirac, many years ago, wanted to put a carbon tax. Well, maybe we have to start thinking again on that. But that asymmetry also triggers a question on incentives. You concluded your presentation, Gonzalo, saying, okay, incentives. When I was director of the European Commission for Planet and Prosperity, I conceived this big investment plan for Africa, where incentives for sustainability were the key to cover the risk of entrepreneurs in risky places in Africa. It didn't work. It didn't work because the banking system, which is supposed to implement that kind of incentive scheme, is still a banking system. And even if it's covered by a guarantee by somebody else, in that case the European Union, the reputation in the market affects them if they get a loss. And that has stopped everything virtually. So I came to, that was 2016, so I came to the understanding that we have to change the economic theory from the basement, because otherwise the financial system will not behave the way we want to do for incentives to work. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, and coming from someone who's been a Director General at the European Commission, that's really interesting. Let me just give you an example of some malfunctions that I see. You're now in a country, Spain, with 75% of the territory prone to desertification. 20% of the country is already certified. Yeah? If you go to Southeast Spain and you talk to a farmer and you say, where are you taking water from? They will tell you, I'm mostly using surface runoff when I have water, which is not like, oftentimes. And I'm also withdrawing water from the aquifers. And it's an overexploited aquifer, yeah? High levels of salinity, it's polluted, diffuse pollution, nitrates, and all that. But they're still using that water. They pay something like 10 cents per cubic meter, right? If you offer them a regenerative approach and you say, no, just, the European Commission is putting lots of money to promote circular economy. So why not using circular economy? Why not reclaiming this water, regenerating it through advanced membrane technologies and being able to reuse it? That goes up to, let's say, 50 cents, yeah, or 45 cents per cubic meter. And if you tell them about the installed capacity of desalination, this is the top 5 country in the world in terms of desalination of salt water. If you tell them about the use of water from the desalination plant, that goes up to €1 per cubic meter, yeah? At the plant, when you connect it to the plot, it's like 2-3 euros, okay? So they say something similar to what you said. You need to make this economically feasible for these people. Right. The issue, from my viewpoint, is first, we cannot foster circular economy without fostering at the same time industrial symbiosis. We need to have institutional innovation to create markets. But then at the same time, a crazy paradox again. We put money to remove nutrients from water in order to be regenerated and potentially reused, but the most significant market for that water to be reused is agriculture, and then we need to add nutrients again, because agricultural producers will need water again. So we're paying twice for the same. It's crazy. We remove something, then we need to add. And we're doing this on a continuous basis. So I think that from my viewpoint, I'm not saying that tackling incentives is the only thing we have to do at all. Yeah? I'm just putting my small contribution, my humble contribution to this. I think we need to redesign, to rethink all these incentives.
I have another question. That grass in the background, is plastic or is it real?
Very good question. And thank you. It's a good way to move on. Thank you both very much.